Across the folklore of many Slavic nations can be found the hero of gold or iron, who is blessed with his weapon embodying the sky, which he threw into orbit around the sun, who afterward set out on a quest with 2 or 3 giants or half-giants to defeat the Lord of Snakes and rescue either his siblings or a princess, only for the hero to then be betrayed by the giants. In Ukraine, he is Kotygoroshko, to Slovenes he is Kresnik, and in many villages of southern Poland he is Iron-handed Martain, or Iron-handed Martin. His tale found in places across the country, but most famously recorded in Kohlberg's ethnographies. This set of folklore about the sky hero isn't isolated to the Slavs. A more general version about human brothers is shared with Hungarians and Caucasus nations like the Ossetians, whose own heroes travel also to the afterlife gardens beneath earthly caves to encounter the Lord of Snakes. This sort of folkloric DNA could suggest an ancient quality, that an ancient myth was shared between many Eastern European and Northwest Asians, who adopted it similarly into Christianity, and these ideas are explored in our video about Perun. On this cold winter day, feeling rather sick myself, I'd like to warm my heart by telling the tale of Iron Marcin, as I learned it orally, with limited elaboration from several of the written versions. Many years ago, in the early days of the world, there was a virtuous man named Marcin, who suffered the misfortune of watching his family succumb to tragedy. By the time he was an old man, he was the only surviving member of his lineage, and at a great age he was struck by a terrible sickness which seized him for weeks, and lying in bed fearing death had come for him, he had nearly accepted his fate when a stranger knocked on his door. Straining himself to let the guest in, even though he was near death and in no shape to help, he still offered all available hospitality to the stranger, attempting to cook for him, before the effort sent him back to lying in bed, shaking and shivering with fever. But the effort was appreciated. The stranger retrieved mysterious herbs and cooked them into a hot soup, which he fed to Marcin as he laid in bed. And after Marcin drank and drank and drank the soup, he found his strength miraculously restored. With some effort he was able to stand out of bed, and with another serving he found himself with the strength of a young man. And at this the stranger shed his cloak and revealed himself to be an angel. And the angel told Marcin that in return for his virtuous life, always doing the right thing, living as good as any man could, he had been blessed with a second bout at life. And in gratitude Marcin thanked him, and then left his house in the forest and sat out on the road, determined to do something worthwhile to make his second life worth it. The next day Marcin hauled all of his valuable belongings, what little he had, on a cart to the village, and in the village he met with the blacksmith, selling him all of his valuables in exchange for the most precious iron he could possibly find. And after an entire day of sending his assistants far and wide to gather the most pure iron in the realm, the blacksmith took it all and forged for Marcin a beautiful iron staff. After 3 days of laboring at the blacksmith's forge, he presented it to Marcin, who took it in his hands, and with a hefty throw he tossed it into the sky. The iron rod shot straight up and disappeared. Only the keen eyes of falcons would see that the rod went all the way to the sun, which it then spun around. With the rod disappeared, Marcin laughed and gathered the blacksmith and his assistants together and offered them all to drink. So they went to the tavern and began to drink and celebrate all the hard work. It was an entire afternoon, evening, and morning that had passed, and by the next day Marcin gathered them all together and stuck his hand into the sky, at which point the rod came back into view, plummeting down at a tremendous speed, and with the ferocious roar of thunder the rod shot into his hand. With whoops and cheers from the townspeople, Marcin set off into the wilderness, looking for adventure and problems to solve. It is on his first day of wandering that he came up across a forest clearing where many giant ancient trees had been fallen. It looked as if a cyclone had passed through, ravaging the forest, so he followed the trail to see what it led to. And a little down the way he saw a mighty man, almost as giant as he, and this giant man with very little effort was uplifting a ancient trees and tossing them as if they were weeds. He saw Iron Marcin and shook his hand. His name was Oaklifter, and he hailed from Krakow, and he offered for them to travel together, since as two men and no wolves or other forest beasts would dare attack them in all of their might. Marcin smiled and extended his hand, and they did a bout of strength, attempting to knock the other down, and finding each other fairly evenly matched. So they both smiled and laughed, having found such an equal, brotherly man, and they set out on the forest road. It was on the next day that Marcin and Oaklifter found a trail of pebbles, which became a trail of stones. It went up the Carpathian Mountains, and as they followed this trail of rocks, they became boulders, and eventually they found the source of the rubble, for it was a giant man who was punching his way through the mountain itself. And where he punched, the stone splintered into boulders, and where there were boulders, he stomped and kicked and broke them down into pebbles. He turned and smiled and greeted the two other men. He explained that he was Mountain Lifter. He himself hailed from Krakow. He took the hands of the equally mighty men, and they all tried to knock each other down to no avail. They were all fairly equally matched. And again they all laughed and smiled at having found another brotherly strong man. They decided that it would be best for them to travel together, so again they set out on the road. The three men had been walking for quite some time, and they came across a chimney in the distance. The spewing of smoke in the afternoon sky told them of a place to stay for the night, so they made their way to the source of the chimney smoke to find a house that seemed abandoned. The fire was still smoldering, but no lights were on inside. They entered the house, and it seemed in a state of disrepair. Nothing was organized, everything was dusty, it was an absolute mess. Not sure what to make of it, the three men decided that this place would be a good place to spend the night, as it was getting late in the year, and tonight there would be a frost. So it was decided that Oaklifter and Marcin would go out into the forest, and that Mountain Thrower would stay and try to tend to the fire. The other two men would try to get some game, and they would bring it back and make a supper. So Oaklifter and Marcin headed out into the forest, and as Mountain Thrower sat in the dusty, dark building, tending to the fire and starting to make a stew, he heard little sounds of scuttling in the beams above his head, and looking up into the space above the room, he saw a tiny little dwarf. His eyes gleamed in the darkness, and the strange little man laughed and jumped down onto the floor. The little man was spry, but obviously showed his age. He wasn't threatening at all, and he hobbled next to the fire and put his hands out for warmth, and one hand he extended to the Mountain Thrower and said, "Hello, my good man, you seem very mighty. Would you like to test your strength against a little old man like me? I remember when I was mighty like you in my youth." Mountain Thrower smiled at the friendly gesture and also laughed at such the thought. So he took the little dwarf's hand in his, and in a shock the little dwarf threw him over his head, tossing him to the ground very painfully. The dwarf laughed a wicked laugh, and as he tried to jump to his feet, he was stomped down again. The dwarf jumped onto the fire in the fireplace, extinguishing it and tossing the pot all over the floor. And with wicked laughter, the dwarf ran up the chimney and disappeared. A short time later, Marcin and Oakthrower returned to the house to find Mountain Lifter still on the floor, trying to collect the scattered and wet firewood, and they laughed and asked what could have possibly happened, and when he explained what had happened, they didn't believe him. It was simply too ridiculous. So instead, with the firewood rather ruined for now, they made do with a simple meal, and from there they called it a night. The next morning it was decided that Marcin and Mountain Thrower would go out into the forest, and that Oak Thrower would stay behind and try to tend to a fire, so that they could cook a hearty breakfast. So again, Marcin set out into the forest with his companion, and Oak Thrower got to tending the fire and starting to make a stew. And as he labored over the fire, he heard a little clamoring in the corner of the room, and as he looked over, he saw a tiny little dwarf man coming out from behind some clutter. The dwarf hobbled very feebly, as if he was ill, moments away from dying, and the dwarf sat down down next to him, coughing and sputtering, and he explained how terrible he felt and how very near to death he was, and he asked the mighty Oaklifter if he would please feed him some of that stew, and Oaklifter, taking pity on the pitiable, prepared a little bowl of stew, and took a spoon and extended it to him, and as his hand went out, the dwarf seized the spoon in one hand, and pulling it forward, grabbed the wrist of Oaklifter with the other, and with a mighty tug he sent Oaklifter flying over his head and crashing into the wall. Oaklifter sputtered on the floor as the dwarf giggled maliciously, stomping out the fireplace and flying up the chimney. Soon after, the other two men returned to the house and asked what had happened, and Oaklifter explained the predicament, and to this Marcin laughed, still not totally convinced, but thinking of a way to see what was true. So later that day for lunch it was decided that Oaklifter and Mountain Lifter would go out into the forest and look for some game, and Marcin would stay behind and tend to the fire. So the other two men went out into the forest, and Marcin took his place. A short time later, as Marcin was working on a stew and a roast, he heard a squabbling in the corner, and he knew the little dwarf had come. He waited until the dwarf approached, and before he could speak, Marcin spoke to him. "Ah, grandfather, you've finally arrived. Maybe you've come to treat me the way you treated my brothers?" And before the dwarf could respond, Marcin spun around. His iron rod was fast as the wind, and he threw it at the dwarf, knocking him off his feet. And as the dwarf was stunned, he grabbed him by his beard and pulled him up, the dwarf kicking and shouting as Marcin dragged him outside of the house. "This is what you get, you bastard, for abusing their hospitality," Marcin barked, taking up an axe and dragging him to an ancient and giant oak tree that grew in front of the house. Marcin took the axe and cut giant nooks and crannies into the tree, and taking the dwarf's beard, he tied it all in knots all around the tree, so that the dwarf hung limply and upside down from his beard, all tangled up in the tree. And no matter how the dwarf kicked and begged, he could not free himself, and Marcin sat back satisfied. And after a short time, Marcin heard his brothers approach from the forest, so he went inside the house and greeted them, happy to present that he had finished cooking. So they took the stew, and they took some fresh meat, and they put it together, and in a short time they had a delicious meal. And they sat and drank and laughed and told stories until eventually Oaklifter and Mountain Lifter asked what had happened, and Marcin explained that he had caught the scheming little dwarf, and he took them outside to see his prize. So Marcin led them outside behind the house, but they found that there was no more oak tree. Where it had once stood, there was a massive hole in the ground, broken roots jutting into the soil. Evidently the dwarf in a fury had tore the entire tree free, though where the dwarf had gone he left a path of destruction, leading away into the forest. So the three men sized up the situation and decided that they would finish off the little dwarf once and for all. So they followed this path of destruction, and after 3 days and nights of following through forests, across ravines, up and down the sides of mountains, they came to where the destruction ended. They had come to the top of the mountains, and between the bare mountainous peaks was a giant chasm leading far deep into the earth. And sizing up the chasm, the three men saw a giant stone fortress at the bottom of it. So they made their way down the sides of the chasm into the fortress, and inside the fortress they found a pit, a deep black pit going down and down, seemingly forever, into nothingness. In this pit there was a basket hanging by a rope like a well. The three men sized it up, and the Oaklifter said, "Marcin, my brother, you are the strongest and mightiest of us all. You should go down there and see what there is to see." And Marcin agreed. He climbed into the basket, and so Oaklifter and Mountain Lifter stood at the end of the pit, and they worked the rope and lowered Marcin down. And in the pitch blackness Marcin descended and descended and descended. It might have been hours, it might have been days, but eventually the perfect black gave way to light, and at the bottom of the blackness there was a garden and a magnificent forest. Marcin emerged from the basket and followed the trail of destruction through this underground garden, and it led to a giant black stone palace. The giant black stone palace's gates were open, and he stepped inside. The first floor of the Black Palace was very barren, but finding a staircase up, he entered a bedroom where there was a maiden lying in distress. She was in a beautiful dress, decorated in pearls, spoiled and enchanted, but her eyes were red. She had clearly been crying for a very long time. She was on her knees in the corner, looking at the fireplace, when she heard Marcin approach and turned to him. Her eyes were wide, and Marcin asked, "I'm sorry to intrude, but I'm looking for a dwarf who has harmed my brothers. Have you seen a dwarf around here?" The princess shot up and gestured for Marcin to shush down. She came close to him and whispered, "The dwarf lives here. This is his palace." Marcin elaborated, "Yeah, a dwarf with a big oak tree stuck in his beard?" She nodded, shushing him again. "The room next to this are his chambers. He's sleeping in his bed. I've been his prisoner for a very long time. Please, can you help me? Oh, there's no escaping him. He's terrible. He's small, but he's strong because he's a great wizard. His children are the snakes, and they guard the way out of this. His castle has no lock, but it doesn't need one, because if I try to escape, his children take me and bring me back to him. Oh, I need your help, stranger, but you can't possibly defeat him. He will kill you. He will destroy you, and I'll be stuck here forever." Marcin respectfully took her hand and chuckled. "Oh, we'll see how mighty he is." And the great man, not concerned with being sneaky, bravely strode into the adjoined room. He entered the chamber to see the dwarf lying in bed, the shattered branches of the oak tree all around, as apparently he had finally destroyed it with all of the traveling. The dwarf was a tangled mess in his bed, but clearly was not physically harmed. He was snoring away very contentedly as Marcin approached and banged on the wall with his staff. "You fiend, you tricked and humiliated my brothers, so now you answer to me." The dwarf awoke and calmly got to his feet. The princess entered the room, concerned. The dwarf laughed wickedly and gestured to her. "Oh, my maid, just who I wanted to see. Fetch me and the guests some drinks. We'll sit down and have a good time." He went in close to the princess and said in a hush, "Bring 1 chalice of the waters of life and 1 chalice of the waters of death. Give the stranger the waters of death and give your master the waters of life." The princess nodded. For so long she felt she had no choice but to obey him, and she went to the cellars of the great black castle where there were the waters of death and life, and she fetched a chalice of both and brought them to the guest and the master of the house. The dwarf beckoned for the two to sit, and they sat at the table and took up their glasses. The dwarf boasted confidently to Marcin, toasted him, and took up his glass, drinking it quickly and confidently, as Marcin did the same. They put down their empty glasses and stared at one another for a moment, the dwarf then hunching over in pain and collapsing to the ground. Marcin laughed and stood up, taking up his staff, beginning to turn to walk away in victory, but the princess ran to him, grabbed his hand and shouted, "It's not over. The wicked man cannot just die. He has terrible powers, terrible secrets." And in that moment, the dwarf ceased to be a dwarf. His form twisted and expanded rapidly. Where once there had been the tiny man, there was now the Lord of Snakes. He was a mighty serpent, with 7 heads with 7 crowns glittering. He stood as tall as the entire room. His arms were mightily muscular, and the back of him twisted into coils. And the Lord of Snakes laughed, and snapped his jaws at Marcin, and in a fury of fangs and venom, the snapping heads of the Lord of Snakes went to work, attempting to destroy Iron Marcin. Unprepared to find that the man was as fast as he was strong, he whirled his staff of iron around as if it was the wind itself. He smashed it into a neck of the serpent with a flash, and with the roar of thunder cleaved the head right off of the beast. But to Marcin's shock, as the head fell down on the ground, the serpent merely stumbled and then leaned back down, and the head of the beast rejoined into the body as if nothing had happened. So Marcin strained and swirled. He knocked off 2 heads at once, 3 heads at once, 5 heads at once, but nothing he could do was enough. As soon as he severed a head, it was mere moments before it rejoined the beast, and the Lord of Snakes laughed at his folly. The princess shouted, "Stranger, I know what we must do." She ran to the sides of the chamber and flung open the windows. "When you cut off a head, throw it out of the window. Throw it from the castle and it will fall into the waters of death." Marcin nodded and struggled and strained. As he cut off a head, he took it and flung it out of the window, and with all of the speed that he threw his rod, the head disappeared, plummeted down into the darkness, and it did not return. The Lord of Snakes stumbled back. 1 head, 2 heads, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And so the great snake, with no heads remaining, crumpled to the ground, defeated. The princess went up to Marcin with a friendly embrace, and he reassured her, "Let's get you out of here. My revenge is complete, and you do not belong in a place like this." So Marcin and the princess left the Black Palace and returned through the gardens of the world below, until they came to the place where the basket still hung, and Marcin set her in the basket and gave the rope a tug. And though it was too high up to hear the 2 other men, they felt the tug and began to pull up the basket, and in time the princess disappeared up above. So Marcin sat and rested from the fight, and in due time the basket returned to the ground. But before he got into it, he felt a terrible feeling in his stomach. So unsure but wanting to be cautious, he decided to hoist up some stones and put them into the basket, and then he gave a tug for the basket to be brought up. And so the basket began to rise. But it was only about an hour later that Marcin saw the basket come crashing down, since the rope had been severed. And Marcin's heart twisted, for clearly, while he had wanted to free the princess, it was evident that his brothers had decided to take her for themselves, and betrayed him for it, and now Marcin was trapped in the world below. Devastated, betrayed, and seemingly hopeless, Marcin set off into the forests and gardens, and wandered for a very long time. As he wandered through the forest beneath the world, a great storm started to pick up. The great winds came crashing through the forest, knocking down trees and devastating everything, and after a very short time Marcin had to take shelter in a crevice beneath a tree. He found the greatest oak tree in the forest and hid between its roots as all of the branches were stripped clean from the tree, and the great devastation raged through the land. As these storm winds howled, Marcin looked around, and he saw, with astonishment, that the knocked-free branches had sent eggs tumbling to the ground, giant shimmering eggs, like those of an eagle. Not hesitating for a moment, Marcin crawled from his shelter. He pulled himself with such effort, climbing across the ground as if he was climbing a cliff. But he made his way to the eggs, and he gently took them in his arms, and he brought them back to his shelter in the roots of the great tree. And with those ravaging winds, he cradled the eggs gently and sheltered them from the storm with his body. And after a very long time, the storm winds ended, and Marcin stepped out of his hiding space into the now devastated, leveled forest. Everything was turmoil. Anything caught in it would have been destroyed. He kneeled and placed down the eggs which he had saved, and as he stood back up, he found he was no longer alone. A giant eagle, with the paws of a beast, stood before him, her wings outstretched as wide as the branches of a tree. She looked down to Marcin and she spoke. "Stranger, you have saved my children. With no concern to the safety of your body, you acted selflessly and nobly. I will help you, stranger, in return for how you have helped me. What can I do to help you?" Marcin bowed graciously to the great bird and requested only one thing, that she lift him from the world below and return him to the normal world of the people. The great bird nodded and lifted her wings, giving a whistle, and in response the winds returned, but this time not hostilely. They were soon joined and surrounded by the wind horses, commanded by the great bird, and one of the wind horses approached Marcin and bowed to him, and she picked up Marcin in her beak oak and placed him on top of the giant steed. And with a whistle, this great horse made of winds shot through the underworld, racing through the air, rocketing up through the black chasm and erupting into the sky. The wind horse ran as fast as Marcin could throw his staff. It tore through the sky like an arrow, and in no time Marcin and the wind horse had found the trail of the treacherous brothers. They likewise had left a path of devastation, upturned trees and shattered boulders, terrorizing the countryside in their drunken celebration. It led to a castle within a kingdom at the far end of the world, and in this castle there was Oak Lifter and Mountain Lifter and the princess that Marcin had rescued. He approached on the horse, looking down at the scene to see that the two greedy men were dressed for a wedding, attempting with all their might to force the princess to marry one of them, and bickering with each other about who would get her hand. And the princess's eyes were red, and because the two men were so bitterly indecisive, the father of the princess, the old king ready to retire, sat them both down and decided, fine, if neither of you can decide who will wed my daughter, then we need to settle this with a competition. And he took them to a place in the fortress of the castle where a great metal rod stuck out from the foundations. All of the old fortress rested upon it. To move it would be like moving the earth itself. And the king grumbled, "Whichever of you can remove this staff will be the husband of my daughter, but neither of you shall have her until the deed is done." And after several days of struggling, bickering, and drinking, neither Oak Lifter nor Mountain Lifter became any closer to taking her hand. Marcin came down outside the city and let the wind horse return to its mother. So he snuck into the city disguised as some ordinary peasant and asked the city for some sort of job so he could feed himself, and the city allowed him to be the humble servant who lit the furnace in the hall of the great palace. It was another day of bickering, with Oak Lifter and Mountain Lifter resting beside the giant length of iron jutting from the fortress, that Marcin decided to approach it. As he entered the room, the princess saw the stranger under his cloak and gasped, but didn't say anything. Marcin looked to the king and asked what the two mighty men were doing here, and he explained the rules of the competition. So Marcin faced the giant metal beam, and he took it in both of his hands and gave it a mighty pull. He pulled it straight from the foundation and sent it flying up into the sky, and after a few moments it landed far away with the sound of thunder. Oak Thrower and Mountain Thrower dropped to their knees, astonished. It was Marcin. The king jumped up and laughed in joy. He addressed Marcin as he threw off his cloak, and the princess smiled and explained, "Father, this is the good man who actually rescued me from the snake. This is the good man who these two left." To which Oak Lifter and Mountain Lifter attempted to disagree, but the king was clearly already persuaded. There's a version of the story that Marcin never revealed himself, pulling out the iron in secret, so nobody ever married the princess. But in the version I know, the wedding was magnificent. It was famous all around the world, and for many centuries people talked of that mighty wedding of Iron Marcin and the princess. And after this, the two other mighty men, Oak Lifter and Mountain Lifter, would return to their homeland of Krakow, where they would return in several more of their own folk tales. The tale of Iron Marcin's journey through the underworld is clearly one of the wider pattern of stories that we talked about in the video about Perun. But since it was by far the first story of its type that I learned, this is probably why it continues to be my favorite. The simple-spoken and straightforward virtues of Marcin and the cleverness but humbleness of the princess are two features in this story not present in all of them, which I also take a very specific liking to. If we are to believe the folklore of Krakow, Oak Lifter and Stone Lifter returned to their city sometime during the time of Krak and his children, somewhere between 500 and 700. Though I'm not aware of any stories that specifically say that Oak Lifter and Stone Lifter hereafter live the lifespan of ordinary men, and given all of their other mighty attributes, I find it reasonable to speculate that they might have also been blessed with long lives. After all, the giants who built the mountains were very nearly immortal, and the giants who descended from the mountains were seemingly only slain because God struck them with lightning. So if we listen to the very flawed chronology of folklore, that would place the time of Marcin the hero before the time of Krak, possibly in the time of the Lekites, or if we take the story at its word, then in the very early days of the world, often mythological code for a creation story. Thus the reason that sibling stories similar to this, such as the tale of Shoslan from the Ossetians, is often interpreted by folklorists to be a descended and slightly altered version of a mythological story from the days of polytheism. I won't 100% assuredly assert that the story of Marcin is descended from the story of Perun in a direct way, but Marcin definitely demonstrates qualities and symbolic elements reflective of the older beliefs, in ways that just make the story make me really happy, and retelling it makes my heart warm on the cold, cold winter day. So thank you for taking some time to listen to a story. This year was absolutely chaotic. It was hectic. I didn't get nearly as much done as I wanted to, especially with how busy work is right now. I wish I could have been more productive, but it is what it is. I hope I feel better and am able to do a bit better next year. Thank you everyone who's been watching. I hope you've had a wonderful year. I hope you're having a wonderful holiday season, and I hope to talk to you again next year, with our next video coming up being another long analysis of a deity, this time the motherland, Mokosh.